On July 3, 1863, as Confederate General Pickett's charge thundered across the Pennsylvania fields toward Cemetery Ridge, something impossible walked among the wounded soldiers of Gettysburg. Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman whose medical records would later confound 3 generations of physicians, moved between the dying men with hands that had not aged a single day in over 2 decades. Survivors of that bloodiest battle would swear under oath that the same woman who tended their wounds in 1863 had delivered their children in Baltimore 23 years earlier, unchanged, unaged, as if time itself had forgotten her existence. Military surgeons documented her presence. Town records bore her signature, yet no medical journal of the era could explain what dozens of witnesses claimed to see. The United States Army Medical Department buried her case file in 1864, stamping it with a classification that would remain sealed for nearly a century. Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth Caldwell, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling historical mysteries that official records tried to bury. Comment below and tell us what state you're listening from, because tonight's tale proves that some secrets run deeper than any government archive ever intended. The woman who defied every known law of human biology was about to become the most documented medical anomaly of the Civil War era, and her story begins not on the battlefields of Pennsylvania, but in the gaslit streets of Baltimore, where whispers of her strange condition first began to spread through the medical community like wildfire. Baltimore in 1840 stood as one of America's great port cities, where steamships brought European immigrants by the thousands and railroad lines stretched toward the expanding frontier. The city's cobblestone streets echoed with a dozen languages, while its hospitals and medical colleges attracted some of the nation's most ambitious physicians. The humid Chesapeake climate created perfect conditions for disease outbreaks that tested the limits of medical knowledge, making Baltimore's physicians among the most experienced in treating unusual conditions. It was here, in the respectable neighborhood of Mount Vernon, that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell first encountered the woman who would haunt his medical practice for the next quarter-century. Elizabeth Caldwell arrived at his clinic on Charles Street during the autumn of 1840, seeking treatment for what she described as persistent fatigue. Dr. Hartwell recently graduated from the University of Maryland Medical School with honors in anatomical studies, noted in his journal that she appeared to be approximately 28 years of age, with auburn hair, green eyes, and the pale complexion common among women of good breeding. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, owned a successful shipping firm with contracts throughout the Chesapeake Bay region, transporting tobacco from Virginia plantations and manufactured goods from northern cities. They lived quietly in a 3-story brick townhouse on Monument Street, attended Presbyterian services regularly at Franklin Street Church, and seemed unremarkable in every way except for one troubling detail that would emerge only with the passage of time. Mrs. Caldwell's medical file, preserved in the archives of Baltimore's Mercy General Hospital, contains routine entries spanning 23 years, births attended, minor ailments treated, seasonal consultations for various family members, and detailed annual physical examinations that Dr. Hartwell insisted upon maintaining for all his regular patients. Yet buried within these mundane records lies a mystery that 3 different physicians would independently document, each reaching the same impossible conclusion. Elizabeth Caldwell was not aging at the expected rate. Dr. Hartwell's careful measurements, recorded annually during routine examinations using the most precise instruments available, showed no significant changes in her physical appearance between 1840 and 1850. Her height remained constant at 5 feet 4 inches. Her weight fluctuated only with seasonal changes, and her bone density showed none of the gradual decline expected in women approaching 40 years of age. The Baltimore medical community of the 1850s operated under strict protocols established by the Maryland State Medical Society. Physicians kept meticulous records, shared unusual cases through professional correspondence published in the Baltimore Medical Journal, and maintained detailed patient files that could withstand scrutiny from colleagues during monthly medical society meetings. When Dr. Hartwell first mentioned the Caldwell anomaly during a presentation on unusual aging patterns in 1855. His fellow physicians dismissed it as observation bias or record-keeping errors. But as more doctors examined Mrs. Caldwell over the years for childbirth, injuries, routine health concerns, and family medical emergencies, a disturbing pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Multiple independent observers, trained at different medical schools and practicing different specialties, were documenting the same impossible thing. A woman who appeared to be aging at perhaps 1/3 the normal rate. Thomas Caldwell's shipping business thrived during the 1850s boom years, allowing the family to maintain their social standing despite whispered speculation about his wife's unusually youthful appearance. Elizabeth bore 3 children between 1842 and 1848, Margaret, Thomas Jr., and little Sarah, each birth documented by different physicians who noted her remarkable recovery rate and unchanged physical condition. Society matrons in Baltimore's fashionable circles began to comment privately about Mrs. Caldwell's apparent use of European cosmetics or other beauty treatments, though none could identify what methods might produce such dramatic results. The family's Presbyterian minister, Reverend Samuel Wickham, mentioned in his personal diary that Elizabeth Caldwell looked precisely the same in 1860 as she had when he'd first met her in 1841. Describing it as a curiosity of divine providence that confounds mortal understanding and challenges our assumptions about the natural progression of earthly life. As tensions between North and South intensified in the late 1850s, Baltimore found itself increasingly divided along political and economic lines. The city's position on the Mason-Dixon line made it a crucial strategic location, and families like the Caldwells faced difficult choices about their loyalties. Thomas Caldwell's shipping contracts included both northern and southern ports, making political neutrality essential for business survival. But when war finally came in 1861, neutrality became impossible to maintain, and the Caldwell family would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would ultimately provide the perfect opportunity to document Elizabeth's impossible condition under the most scrutinized circumstances in American history. The Baltimore riot of April 19, 1861, shattered whatever illusions the Caldwell family had maintained about remaining neutral in the coming conflict. As the 6th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment attempted to march through Baltimore toward Washington, D.C., Confederate sympathizers attacked the Union soldiers with stones, bricks, and gunfire in the narrow streets around Camden Station. 12 civilians and 4 soldiers died in the violence, while dozens more lay wounded in the cobblestone streets that ran red with blood. The riot marked the first bloodshed of the Civil War on Maryland soil, and it would provide the first documented evidence of Elizabeth Caldwell's extraordinary medical capabilities under crisis conditions. Elizabeth Caldwell was present at the riot, though her reasons for being near the train station that morning remain unclear from surviving records. Some witnesses claimed she had been shopping at the nearby Lexington market, while others suggested she was visiting the station to meet arriving relatives. What is documented, however, is her immediate response to the carnage that erupted around her. Witnesses later testified before a military tribunal that she moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency, stanching bleeding with strips torn from her own petticoats, providing comfort to dying men with words that seemed to calm even the most agitated patients, and organizing other women to assist in medical care with the authority of someone who had managed similar crises before. Dr. Marcus Fleming, chief surgeon at Baltimore's University Hospital, arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the violence began to find Mrs. Caldwell already directing an improvised field hospital in Hearst's warehouse near the station. The sight that greeted him would fundamentally challenge his understanding of civilian medical capabilities and remain vivid in his memory for the rest of his career. Elizabeth had organized the available space with surgical precision, separating the wounded by severity of injury, establishing clean and contaminated areas, and implementing infection control procedures that exceeded the standards practiced in most established hospitals. The woman possessed medical knowledge far beyond what any respectable lady should know. Dr. Fleming wrote in his official report to the Maryland State Medical Board. She understood human anatomy with the precision of a trained physician, spoke knowledgeably about surgical procedures with technical vocabulary that suggested formal education, and demonstrated familiarity with wound treatment that indicated extensive prior experience with traumatic injuries. When I inquired about her background, she claimed only to have assisted in family medical matters over the years and to have read extensively in her husband's medical texts. Yet her competence suggested formal training or prolonged exposure to battlefield conditions that seemed impossible for a woman of her social class and apparent age. More troubling than her medical expertise was the recognition she received from wounded soldiers and civilians alike. At least 7 witnesses, interviewed separately by military investigators over the following weeks, claimed to remember Elizabeth Caldwell from previous encounters spanning back over 15 years. An Irish immigrant named Patrick O'Malley insisted she had delivered his first child in 1845, appearing exactly as she did in 1861, down to a distinctive scar on her left hand from what she had described as a childhood accident. A Confederate sympathizer, wounded in the riot, swore she had treated his brother's injuries during a dock accident in 1847, showing no signs of aging in the intervening 14 years. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Union Captain James Hendricks, who claimed that Mrs. Caldwell had attended his wedding reception in 1843 and looked precisely the same 18 years later, even wearing what appeared to be the same emerald earrings she had worn on that long-ago evening. Dr. Fleming's report concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. I recommend that military medical authorities take note of Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell should she appear at future battle sites. Her medical knowledge appears to exceed that of many trained surgeons, and her apparent immunity to the aging process warrants scientific investigation, though I acknowledge the impossibility of the latter phenomenon under any known medical theory. There are aspects of this woman's capabilities that challenge our fundamental understanding of human physiology and deserve further study under controlled conditions. The Baltimore riot marked a turning point not only in the Civil War, but in Elizabeth Caldwell's documented history. Military records from that day forward would track her movements with increasing precision, creating a paper trail that would become impossible to ignore or explain away. As Union and Confederate forces prepared for larger battles ahead, the woman who never aged was about to step onto the most scrutinized battlefield in American history, where her presence would be recorded by dozens of independent observers whose testimonies would create an unshakable foundation of evidence for her impossible condition. The aftermath of the Baltimore riot sent ripples throughout the medical and military establishments that would eventually converge at Gettysburg. Union Army Medical Director Dr. Jonathan Letterman, tasked with revolutionizing battlefield medicine for the massive armies now mobilizing, had received Dr. Fleming's report about Elizabeth Caldwell and filed it with a growing collection of unusual cases that defied medical explanation. The Civil War was producing unprecedented opportunities for medical observation, as thousands of physicians encountered conditions and phenomena never before documented in peacetime practice. Cases of unusual healing rates, inexplicable survival from mortal wounds, and bizarre physiological anomalies were being reported from military hospitals across the country, but none as consistently documented as the Baltimore woman who seemed immune to aging. Thomas Caldwell's shipping business collapsed within months of the riot, a casualty of the political divisions that were tearing Maryland apart. Confederate sympathizers boycotted his services for his wife's aid to Union soldiers, while Union authorities questioned his loyalty due to his previous Southern contracts and his family's known connections to Virginia plantation owners. By late 1861, the family had lost most of their Baltimore properties to creditors and faced social ostracism from both sides of the political divide. Elizabeth, however, seemed energized rather than discouraged by these reversals, as if the crisis had awakened something dormant within her. She began volunteering at military hospitals around Baltimore, her medical skills growing more sophisticated with each passing month in ways that puzzled experienced physicians. Hospital records from 1862 reveal an extraordinary pattern of patient improvement under Elizabeth Caldwell's care that defied statistical probability. Union soldiers suffering from typhoid fever, dysentery, and infected wounds showed recovery rates nearly double the average when she was assigned to their treatment. Dr. Rutledge, still her personal physician despite the family's reduced circumstances, noted that her medical knowledge appeared to be expanding at an impossible rate, as if she were accumulating decades of experience within months. Mrs. Caldwell discusses surgical techniques that I learned only after years of practice, he wrote in February 1862. She describes procedures for treating compound fractures that were taught to me by professors who had studied in Europe, yet she claims no formal training. When I ask about her knowledge, she speaks vaguely of natural aptitude and careful observation of others' work. Yet her competence suggests direct instruction from master surgeons or extensive hands-on experience that she could not have acquired in Baltimore. More unsettling were the reports from patients themselves, documented by hospital chaplains who made regular rounds to provide spiritual comfort to wounded soldiers. Soldiers recovering under Elizabeth's care frequently mentioned dreams or half-conscious memories of her presence during their treatment that contradicted the official duty schedules. These accounts, recorded in the chaplain's daily logs, described a woman who seemed to work tirelessly throughout the night, moving between patients with supernatural endurance, while other nurses collapsed from exhaustion. Private William Kerner of the 2nd Maryland Infantry left a particularly detailed account in a letter to his sister. She never seemed to tire, never appeared different from one day to the next, while the rest of us showed the strain of this terrible war. Other nurses would show exhaustion after 12-hour shifts, but Mrs. Caldwell remained constant, as fresh in the morning as she had been the evening before. It was as if she existed outside the normal flow of time that governed the rest of us, immune to the fatigue that plagued everyone else in that place of suffering. By spring of 1863, Elizabeth Caldwell had acquired a reputation throughout the Union Army Medical Corps as both a gifted healer and a source of growing unease among medical professionals. Surgeons specifically requested her assistance for difficult cases, yet privately questioned the source of her knowledge in letters to colleagues and family members. Soldiers spoke of her with something approaching reverence, but their testimonies contained undertones of fear that they could not articulate. She had become indispensable to the war effort while simultaneously becoming impossible to explain, a contradiction that troubled military physicians who prided themselves on rational scientific approaches to medicine. The medical mystery of Elizabeth Caldwell might have remained confined to Baltimore hospitals if not for a chance encounter in May 1863 that would change everything. Clara Barton, already famous as the angel of the battlefield for her work with wounded soldiers, arrived at Baltimore's Jarvis Hospital to observe treatment methods that could be applied to field hospitals closer to the front lines. Her meeting with Elizabeth Caldwell lasted only 2 hours, but Barton's private correspondence reveals its profound impact on someone who thought she had seen everything the war could offer. "I have encountered a woman whose medical abilities exceed those of trained physicians with decades of experience," she wrote to her sister Sally. "Yet there is something deeply troubling about her that I cannot articulate or fully understand. She speaks of medical procedures with the authority of someone who has witnessed them countless times, though she appears younger than myself. More disturbing, she discusses future battles as if she has already witnessed them, describing wounds and conditions that have not yet occurred, but which, I fear, inevitably will." Clara Barton's recommendation would prove fateful for both Elizabeth Caldwell and the thousands of soldiers who would soon converge on a small Pennsylvania town. When Union forces began concentrating in Pennsylvania during June 1863, preparing for what would become the Battle of Gettysburg, military medical planners specifically requested Elizabeth Caldwell's assignment to the Army of the Potomac's Medical Corps. The woman who had defied aging for over 20 years was about to enter the most documented and scrutinized battle of the Civil War, where her presence would be recorded by dozens of independent observers, whose testimonies would create an unshakable foundation of evidence for her impossible condition. The Army of the Potomac's movement toward Gettysburg in June 1863 represented the largest concentration of military medical personnel in American history up to that point. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's reformed ambulance corps included over 650 surgeons, assistant surgeons, and hospital stewards, creating an unprecedented network of trained observers who would document every aspect of the coming battle with scientific precision. Among these medical professionals, Elizabeth Caldwell's reputation had spread through official channels and private correspondence, making her one of the most anticipated and scrutinized volunteers in the entire medical corps. Word of the Baltimore woman who never aged had reached physicians from Massachusetts to Maryland, creating expectations and curiosity that would prove impossible to satisfy with conventional explanations. Elizabeth arrived in Gettysburg on June 28, 1863, traveling with a supply convoy from Baltimore that included medical equipment donated by wealthy families and volunteer nurses recruited from Presbyterian churches throughout Maryland. The small Pennsylvania town, with its population of just 2,400 residents, was already straining under the influx of both armies converging in the region. Local physician Dr. Robert Horner, whose practice served Adams County and whose family had lived in the area for 3 generations, agreed to provide lodging for female medical volunteers in his family's home on Baltimore Street. His first encounter with Elizabeth Caldwell, recorded in meticulous detail in his personal journal that night, would become one of the most important primary source documents regarding her condition. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at my door on the evening of June 28th, accompanied by 2 other volunteer nurses from Baltimore whose names I have forgotten. Dr. Horner wrote, "I was immediately struck by her youthful appearance, which seemed inconsistent with the extensive medical knowledge she demonstrated during our conversation about the challenges we would likely face in the coming days. When I mentioned that she reminded me of a woman I had met during my medical training in Philadelphia 20 years earlier, she became evasive and changed the subject to discuss the town's water supply and its adequacy for hospital use. Later that evening, I consulted my old medical school notebooks and found my description of a Miss Elizabeth Hartwell who had assisted in a difficult surgery at Pennsylvania Hospital in 1843. The physical description was identical to Mrs. Caldwell in every detail, including a distinctive birthmark near her left ear and the unusual green color of her eyes. Such resemblance would be impossible unless she had been the same person, unchanged by 2 decades of time. Dr. Horner's suspicions deepened when he examined Elizabeth's medical supplies and instruments the following morning. Her surgical kit contained tools of exceptional quality, some bearing manufacturing marks from European firms that had not been available in America 20 years earlier. The scalpels were made from German steel of a grade used only by the most prestigious medical schools, while her suturing materials included silk thread of a quality that cost more than most physicians earned in a month. Yet the wear patterns on these instruments suggested decades of regular use, with the handles polished smooth by countless hours of surgical work. More puzzling still were her medical texts, leather-bound volumes with extensive marginalia in what appeared to be the same handwriting across publications spanning 15 years. The annotations revealed deep understanding of surgical techniques that had only recently been developed in European medical schools. Yet the ink showed varying degrees of age, suggesting they had been made over many years of study and practice. On the morning of June 30th, as Confederate and Union forces began positioning themselves around Gettysburg in preparation for what both sides expected to be a decisive battle, Elizabeth requested permission to survey the likely battlefield areas to identify suitable locations for field hospitals. Dr. Horner accompanied her on this reconnaissance, during which he demonstrated knowledge of the local terrain that seemed impossible for a first-time visitor to Adams County. She pointed out natural features, elevation changes, and water sources with the familiarity of someone who had studied detailed topographical maps for weeks. When questioned about her knowledge, she claimed to have read extensively about Pennsylvania geography, yet her observations included details about underground springs and drainage patterns that appeared in no published sources available to civilian readers. More mysterious was Elizabeth's apparent ability to predict where the heaviest fighting would occur, displaying tactical knowledge that exceeded that of many military officers. Walking across what would become known as Cemetery Ridge, she selected a spot near a small copse of trees and announced, "This location will see the worst carnage. We should prepare our largest field hospital here, with emphasis on treating abdominal wounds and traumatic amputations." Dr. Horner found her certainty unsettling, particularly since no military commanders had yet announced their battle plans, and the terrain offered no obvious tactical advantages. When the fighting began on July 1st, her predictions proved unnervingly accurate, as if she had witnessed the battle before it occurred. The first day of battle brought Elizabeth Caldwell into contact with dozens of wounded soldiers and medical personnel who would later provide testimony about her unprecedented performance under battlefield conditions. Unlike other civilian volunteers who required time to adjust to the horror and chaos of combat medicine, Elizabeth moved among the wounded with immediate competence and seemingly inexhaustible energy that amazed seasoned military surgeons. Surgeon Charles McMillan of the 1st Minnesota Infantry noted that she worked continuously for 18 hours without showing signs of fatigue, treating wounds with speed and skill that exceeded most trained military surgeons, while maintaining perfect composure despite the screams of wounded men and the constant thunder of artillery. But it was during the evening of July 1st that the most disturbing testimonies emerged from multiple independent sources. As medical personnel worked through the night by candlelight and oil lamps, several witnesses independently observed Elizabeth Caldwell in situations that defied logical explanation. Hospital steward William Crawford recorded that she appeared to be working simultaneously in 3 different locations, treating patients in the Lutheran Seminary, the Catholic Church, and a temporary field hospital near Rock Creek. Since these locations were over a mile apart and the roads between them were crowded with military traffic, Crawford initially dismissed his observations as confusion caused by exhaustion. However, other witnesses reported similar sightings, leading to speculation that either multiple women resembling Elizabeth were present, or that she possessed some means of moving between locations faster than seemed humanly possible, given the conditions of a nighttime battlefield. The second day of fighting at Gettysburg brought unprecedented carnage, and with it, the most detailed documentation of Elizabeth Caldwell's mysterious capabilities that would ever be recorded. As Confederate forces launched coordinated attacks on both flanks of the Union line, the volume of wounded overwhelmed every prepared medical facility in ways that tested the limits of 19th-century military medicine. Field hospitals established in churches, barns, and private homes filled beyond capacity, creating desperate conditions that tested every medical volunteer to their physical and emotional limits. Yet throughout the chaos of July 2nd, multiple independent witnesses continued to document Elizabeth's impossible presence in locations that should have been physically unreachable given the constraints of time and distance. Dr. Cyrus Bacon, chief surgeon of the 2nd Corps and a graduate of Harvard Medical School, maintained detailed logs of personnel assignments and movements as part of the Army Medical Department's new documentation requirements. His records show Elizabeth Caldwell officially assigned to the field hospital at the Jacob Schwartz Farm, located south of Gettysburg, near the Round Tops, where Confederate attacks were expected to be heaviest. However, surgeon reports from that same day place her at the Granite Schoolhouse north of town, the George Spangler Farm to the east, and the Abraham Bryan House on Cemetery Ridge. Dr. Bacon's attempts to reconcile these conflicting reports led him to personally observe Elizabeth's movements on the afternoon of July 2nd, resulting in documentation that would haunt his medical career for decades afterward. "I followed Mrs. Caldwell from the Schwartz farm toward town at approximately 2:30 p.m., Dr. Bacon wrote in his official report to Medical Director Letterman. She walked at a normal pace along the Baltimore Pike, carrying her medical bag and showing no signs of unusual haste or supernatural locomotion. I lost sight of her when Confederate artillery fire forced me to take shelter behind a stone wall near the cemetery entrance. When the bombardment ceased approximately 10 minutes later, I proceeded directly to the Spangler farm to verify reports of her presence there. Upon arrival, I found Mrs. Caldwell already treating wounded soldiers, her clothing and hands showing clear evidence of recent surgical work, including bloodstains that were still wet. The assistant surgeon assured me she had been working there continuously since early morning and had never left the premises. Given the distances involved and the timeline of my observations, her presence at both locations appears impossible under normal circumstances. The peculiarities surrounding Elizabeth's movements began manifesting in ways that defied not just observation, but logic itself. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien of the Irish Brigade was wounded during the assault on Devil's Den and transported to the field hospital at the Wycott farm. His account, recorded weeks later while recovering in Washington, D.C., added another disturbing piece to the growing puzzle. As they carried me into the barn that served as our hospital, I was delirious with pain and blood loss from a Confederate Minié ball that had shattered my left shoulder. But I distinctly remember seeing Mrs. Caldwell treating a Confederate officer whose arm had been nearly severed by Union grape shot. She was speaking to him in what sounded like perfect German, discussing his family in Bavaria with intimate knowledge of his hometown and his children's names. When I mentioned this to the surgeon later, he told me the Confederate was indeed a Bavarian immigrant, but had arrived unconscious from blood loss and never spoke a word before dying that evening. How could she have known details about his background that he never had chance to share with anyone? Dr. Bacon's report initiated what would become an unofficial investigation among the medical corps officers who were growing increasingly troubled by the contradictory reports surrounding Elizabeth Caldwell. Throughout the remaining daylight hours of July the 2nd, at least 12 different surgeons attempted to track Elizabeth's movements using predetermined signals and coordination protocols established for managing medical personnel across the battlefield. Their collective observations, compiled into a joint report filed with military headquarters, painted an increasingly disturbing picture that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability. Elizabeth appeared to be maintaining simultaneous presence at multiple medical facilities, performing complex surgical procedures that required sustained attention and steady hands, while also moving between locations in timeframes that defied physical possibility. The investigation took an even more sinister turn when Dr. Ferdinand van der Kieft, a Prussian-trained surgeon serving with the Union Army, decided to conduct what he termed controlled observation experiments. Dr. Van der Kieft positioned trusted colleagues at strategic points around Gettysburg with synchronized pocket watches imported from Switzerland, creating a network of observers who could track Elizabeth's movements with scientific precision unprecedented in military medical history. His preliminary findings, recorded in meticulous German script, revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about human physiology. Subject maintains constant core body temperature of 97.8 degrees Fahrenheit despite extensive physical exertion in 90-degree heat with high humidity. Pulse rate remains steady at 68 beats per minute, even during most demanding surgical procedures that would normally elevate heart rate significantly. Most remarkably, subject shows no signs of perspiration despite working continuously for 14 hours in extreme conditions while wearing heavy cotton clothing. These observations suggest metabolic processes that differ significantly from normal human physiology. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Gettysburg intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next as Elizabeth Caldwell faces the most scrutinized moment of her impossible existence. July 3rd, 1863. Dawned with oppressive heat that would soon be overshadowed by the thunderous roar of the largest artillery bombardment in North American history. Confederate General Lee's plan for a massive frontal assault on Cemetery Ridge required softening the Union lines with concentrated cannon fire that began at 1:07 p.m. and continued for nearly 2 hours. During this bombardment, Elizabeth Caldwell was documented by no fewer than 15 independent observers as she moved through the chaos with behavior that transcended any rational explanation of human capability. The artillery barrage created unprecedented medical emergencies as Union soldiers suffered wounds from shell fragments, concussion injuries, and psychological trauma from the sustained bombardment. Field hospitals that had been established in relatively safe areas behind Cemetery Ridge suddenly found themselves under direct fire, forcing immediate evacuation of wounded men to more secure locations. It was during this desperate hour that Elizabeth Caldwell's actions reached a level of impossibility that even skeptical military physicians could no longer deny or rationalize. Colonel Theodore Lyman, serving as an aide to General Meade, was positioned on Cemetery Ridge with a clear view of the Union medical operations when the Confederate bombardment began. His detailed account, written immediately after the battle, provides the most comprehensive documentation of Elizabeth's impossible performance. As shells exploded around the field hospitals, I observed Mrs. Caldwell directing the evacuation of wounded soldiers with extraordinary composure and efficiency. She appeared to anticipate the trajectory of incoming artillery rounds, moving patients to safety moments before shells struck their previous locations. More remarkable, she seemed to be coordinating evacuation efforts at multiple locations simultaneously. Through my field glasses, I clearly observed her assisting at the Rock Creek Hospital at 1:30 p.m. Yet confirmed reports place her at the Taneytown Road Station at precisely the same time, performing emergency surgery on a Union artillery officer. What Colonel Lyman witnessed through his field glasses would haunt him for the remainder of his military career. As Confederate shells rained down on Cemetery Ridge, Elizabeth moved through the bombardment with what appeared to be supernatural awareness of where each projectile would strike. She evacuated wounded soldiers from buildings seconds before direct hits, redirected medical personnel away from areas that were subsequently destroyed, and maintained surgical procedures in locations that seemed to exist in pockets of impossible safety amid the chaos. Most disturbing of all, Lyman's observations through high-quality German optics revealed physical details that defied explanation. Elizabeth cast no discernible shadow despite the bright afternoon sun, and her clothing remained pristine white despite the smoke, dirt, and blood that covered every other person on the battlefield. Dr. Daniel Hand, senior surgeon with the 1st Corps, was conducting emergency amputations in a barn near Cemetery Ridge when Elizabeth arrived during the height of the bombardment. His surgical log, maintained despite the chaos, records her assistance in procedures that should have required multiple trained assistants. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at my side during the amputation of Private Henderson's shattered arm at approximately 1:45 p.m. She anticipated my needs with uncanny precision, handling instruments and sutures with the skill of a trained surgeon. Most remarkably, she maintained perfect composure despite the continuous artillery fire around us. When I asked how she could remain so calm, she replied, "I have seen worse than this, doctor, much worse." Her tone suggested experiences that no civilian woman of her apparent age could possibly have witnessed. Dr. Hand's surgical log contains additional observations that he initially hesitated to record, fearing they would be dismissed as hallucinations caused by battle stress. However, the consistency of his notes with other witness testimonies compelled him to document what he observed. During the most intensive moments of the bombardment, Mrs. Caldwell appeared to demonstrate preternatural knowledge of each patient's condition before examination. She directed me to prioritize cases based on internal injuries that were not externally visible. Yet her assessments proved accurate in every instance. Most unsettling, she spoke to dying soldiers in languages that matched their countries of origin. Polish to immigrants from Krakow, Italian to men from Naples, Swedish to recent arrivals from Stockholm. When I questioned her about these linguistic abilities, she claimed to have learned from those who suffered before. The implication that she had encountered dying soldiers from dozens of different nationalities seemed impossible for a woman who had supposedly spent her entire life in Baltimore. The bombardment created conditions that pushed Elizabeth's mysterious abilities to their absolute limits, providing the most intensive documentation of her impossible nature. Captain Samuel Wilkson of the New York Tribune, present at Gettysburg as a war correspondent, witnessed events that challenged his journalistic objectivity. I observed Mrs. Caldwell working in a field hospital that took a direct hit from Confederate artillery at 2:15 p.m. The shell struck the building's roof, collapsing timber beams and filling the air with deadly splinters. When the smoke cleared, I expected to find carnage among the wounded soldiers and medical personnel inside. Instead, I discovered that every patient had been moved to safety moments before the impact, despite there being no apparent warning of the incoming shell. Mrs. Caldwell stood calmly among the debris, her white dress unstained by the destruction around her, directing the continued care of wounded men as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The Confederate artillery ceased at 3:00 p.m., followed immediately by the advance of General Pickett's division across the open fields towards Cemetery Ridge. This moment, later known as Pickett's Charge, would provide the most intensive and well-documented evidence of Elizabeth Caldwell's impossible nature. As approximately 15,000 Confederate soldiers advanced across nearly a mile of open ground under devastating Union fire, Elizabeth was observed by multiple witnesses performing actions that defied every known law of physics and human biology. Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, positioned behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, maintained a detailed account of the charge and its aftermath. His observations of Elizabeth Caldwell during the attack remain some of the most disturbing testimony in the entire historical record. As the Confederate line approached our position, I observed Mrs. Caldwell moving along our defensive line, attending to wounded soldiers despite the intense rifle fire. What I witnessed challenges everything I believed possible about human nature. She moved between wounded men with no apparent concern for the bullets whistling around her, yet I never saw her struck or even forced to take cover. More unsettling, she appeared to be present at multiple points along our line simultaneously. I saw her treating Captain Williams near the copse of trees, while my lieutenant swore she was assisting wounded men 50 yards to our right at the same moment. Captain Abbott's account becomes increasingly disturbing as he describes the climactic moments of the charge. When the Confederate assault reached our stone wall, the fighting became hand-to-hand combat of the most vicious nature. Men were falling with bayonet wounds, bullet wounds, and injuries from clubbed muskets. Through this maelstrom of violence, Mrs. Caldwell continued her medical work with impossible calm. I witnessed her step directly between a Union soldier and a Confederate officer who were locked in mortal combat, speaking words that caused both men to lower their weapons and step away from each other. Neither soldier could later explain why they had ceased fighting, describing only a compulsion to stop their violence that they could not resist or understand. It was as if her very presence had the power to interrupt the primal fury of battle itself. The most extraordinary testimony came from Confederate Colonel Lewis Armistead, mortally wounded during the final moments of the charge when his men briefly breached the Union line near the copse of trees. Armistead's deathbed statement, recorded by Union chaplain Father Corby, described an encounter with Elizabeth that defied every assumption about the nature of Civil War medical care. As I lay dying with Union and Confederate blood mixing beneath me, a woman in white appeared at my side. She spoke to me about my family in Virginia, about my children whom I would never see again, about battles I had fought years before this war began. She knew details about my life that I had shared with no one, secrets about my military service in the Mexican War that existed in no official records. When I asked who she was, she replied, "I am someone who has walked too many battlefields, Colonel, someone who has seen too much death." As she spoke, the pain from my mortal wounds diminished, and I felt a peace that I had not known since childhood. Yet there was something in her eyes that spoke of sorrows deeper than any human should bear, as if she carried the weight of every soldier who had ever died in her presence. The repulse of Pickett's charge at approximately 3:30 p.m. created a field covered with thousands of Confederate casualties, providing Elizabeth with the largest concentration of wounded soldiers she had yet encountered. The documentation of her response to this crisis would produce the final, irrefutable evidence of her impossible condition. Union and Confederate soldiers who survived their wounds would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they witnessed in the aftermath of that failed charge. Private Louis Bissell of the 14th Connecticut Infantry, wounded during the assault, provided testimony that encapsulated the mystery surrounding Elizabeth Caldwell. She appeared among us fallen rebels like an angel of mercy, but there was something terrifying about her kindness. She moved from man to man with knowledge of wounds and treatments that seemed to come from lifetimes of experience. When she touched my shattered leg, the pain diminished immediately, yet I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. She spoke to me in a voice that carried the weight of years far beyond her apparent age, asking about my family with a sadness that suggested she had comforted thousands of dying soldiers before me. As she worked, I noticed that her hands showed no signs of aging, no calluses or wear that should have marked decades of medical work. It was as if time itself had forgotten to touch her. The most disturbing aspect of the post-charge testimonies concerned Elizabeth's apparent ability to predict which wounded soldiers would survive and which would die. Dr. Justin Dwinell of the 2nd Vermont Infantry documented her uncanny accuracy in triaging casualties. Mrs. Caldwell moved among the wounded Confederate soldiers with systematic precision, directing our limited medical resources toward those she deemed most likely to recover. Her assessments, made within moments of examination, proved accurate in every case. Men she pronounced beyond saving died within hours despite our best efforts, while those she selected for treatment invariably survived even the most severe wounds. When I asked about her methodology, she explained that she could see the shadow of death in those who would not recover. Such knowledge seemed to require either divine insight or experience with death on a scale that no mortal person should possess. Confederate surgeon Dr. Hunter McGuire, captured while treating wounded soldiers, provided perhaps the most medically detailed account of Elizabeth's impossible abilities. I observed this Union woman examining casualties with techniques I had never seen before. She placed her hands on wounded men's chests and claimed to feel internal bleeding that was not detectable through conventional examination. In every case, surgical exploration proved her assessments correct. She demonstrated knowledge of anatomy that exceeded my own medical school training, describing the location of damaged organs with precision that suggested she could somehow perceive internal conditions without opening the body. When Confederate Captain Morrison died of what appeared to be a minor chest wound, she had predicted his death based on internal bleeding that we could not detect until autopsy confirmed massive hemorrhaging around his heart. The Battle of Gettysburg officially ended on July 4th, but the documentation of Elizabeth Caldwell's impossible presence continued as military surgeons compiled their after-action reports. The collective testimony from over 60 medical personnel, compiled by Dr. Jonathan Letterman for the Army Medical Department, painted a picture of a woman whose capabilities exceeded every known limitation of human physiology, and whose presence at the battle defied rational explanation. The woman who never aged had been observed, documented, and verified by the most credible witnesses in American military history, yet her existence remained as impossible as ever. The immediate aftermath of Gettysburg created a bureaucratic crisis within the Union Army Medical Department that would reverberate through military and civilian medical establishments for decades. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, faced with over 60 independent reports documenting Elizabeth Caldwell's impossible activities during the battle, found himself confronting evidence that challenged the fundamental principles of medical science while simultaneously being impossible to dismiss or explain away. His final report to Surgeon General William Hammond, completed in August 1863, would become one of the most classified documents in American military history. The case of Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell presents medical anomalies that exceed the explanatory power of current scientific knowledge, Dr. Letterman wrote in his confidential summary. Multiple credible witnesses, including experienced military surgeons with impeccable reputations, have documented her presence in locations that should have been physically unreachable given normal human limitations. Her medical knowledge and physical capabilities suggest decades of battlefield experience, yet her appearance remains consistent with that of a woman approximately 30 years of age. After extensive investigation and consultation with medical authorities at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania, I can provide no rational explanation for the phenomena observed. I recommend that this matter be classified at the highest level, and that Mrs. Caldwell be monitored by military intelligence for the duration of the war. Elizabeth's own response to the scrutiny she had attracted was characteristically enigmatic. When directly questioned by Dr. Letterman about the contradictory reports surrounding her activities at Gettysburg, she provided answers that only deepened the mystery. "Doctor, I have dedicated my life to alleviating human suffering wherever it occurs. If my presence brings comfort to wounded soldiers and assists in their recovery, surely that is more important than resolving academic curiosities about my methods or capabilities. Time moves differently for those who have witnessed as much pain as I have. Perhaps your witnesses are simply confused by the chaos of battle and the emotional trauma of seeing so much death in so short a time." Her deflection prompted Dr. Letterman to arrange a comprehensive medical examination by a panel of 3 independent physicians, including Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr., professor of anatomy at Harvard Medical School and one of the most respected medical authorities in America. The results of this examination, conducted in Washington, D.C., in September 1863, provided the first scientific analysis of Elizabeth's impossible condition. Dr. Holmes's report, marked "Confidential Medical Anomaly Investigation," documented physical characteristics that contradicted every known principle of human aging. The subject presents the external appearance of a woman approximately 28 to 32 years of age, with no visible signs of aging despite documented history spanning over 20 years. Skin elasticity, measured using standardized techniques, corresponds to that of a woman in her late 20s. Dental condition shows no wear patterns consistent with her alleged age, with tooth enamel thickness corresponding to someone 20 years younger. Hair texture and pigmentation show no signs of graying or thinning typically associated with middle age. Bone density, measured through careful palpation and strength testing, exceeds average measurements for women of any age. However, examination of her hands reveals callus patterns and scarring consistent with decades of intensive medical work. Most remarkably, her knowledge of anatomy and surgical procedures exceeds that of physicians with 20 years of practice. When questioned about specific techniques, she describes methods and experiences that suggest participation in hundreds of major surgical procedures. The contradiction between her apparent age and documented experience remains medically inexplicable. Dr. Holmes's examination included detailed measurements and photographic documentation using the newly developed albumin print process. However, the photographic attempts encountered the same mysterious failures that had plagued Alexander Gardner's efforts at Gettysburg. Multiple exposures using different cameras and lighting conditions resulted in either completely blank plates or images where Elizabeth appeared as nothing more than a shadowy blur. Dr. Holmes, initially skeptical of the photographic anomalies reported from the battlefield, found himself unable to explain the consistent failures to capture Elizabeth's image despite her clear visibility to direct observation. The comparison with earlier medical records from Baltimore revealed the impossible truth that military observers had been documenting. Elizabeth Caldwell had not aged measurably between 1840 and 1863, despite comprehensive medical documentation spanning 23 years. Her physical measurements, recorded annually by different physicians using standardized techniques, showed variations of less than 1 inch in height, weight fluctuations consistent with seasonal changes, and no progression of age-related changes in bone structure, skin condition, or dental health that should have occurred over more than 2 decades of life. The military's investigation expanded to include Elizabeth's background and family history, revealing additional layers of mystery that complicated rather than clarified her case. Thomas Caldwell, her husband, had died of typhoid fever in Baltimore during early 1863, yet examination of his death certificate revealed discrepancies that suggested possible falsification. The document had been signed by a physician who claimed no memory of treating Thomas Caldwell, and the hospital listed as his place of death had no record of his admission. More disturbing, investigation into Elizabeth's maiden name, Hartwell, led to genealogical records indicating that an Elizabeth Hartwell had died in Philadelphia in 1824 at the age of 6. Either the woman treating soldiers at Gettysburg was using a false identity, or the death records were incorrectly filed. But no explanation could account for the consistency of her documented presence across multiple cities and decades. Military intelligence operatives, working under the direction of Colonel Lafayette Baker, conducted interviews with over 200 individuals who claimed to have encountered Elizabeth Caldwell between 1840 and 1863. Their investigation produced a remarkably consistent portrait of a woman whose physical appearance had remained unchanged across 23 years, whose medical knowledge exceeded that of trained physicians, and whose presence was associated with unusually high survival rates among patients under her care. However, the investigation also revealed disturbing gaps in her documented history. No records existed of her childhood, her education, or her life before 1840. Church baptismal records, school enrollment documents, and family genealogies contained no trace of Elizabeth Hartwell or Elizabeth Caldwell before her marriage in Baltimore. As 1863 drew to a close, Elizabeth Caldwell vanished from military medical records as mysteriously as she had first appeared. Her last documented presence was at Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C., where she had been treating wounded Gettysburg veterans under close military observation. On November 17, 1863, she failed to report for her assigned duties and was never seen again by military personnel. Her personal belongings, including her exceptional medical instruments and annotated surgical texts, were found neatly arranged in her lodgings with a note that read simply, "My work here is completed. The wounded will heal, and the war will end, as all wars do. Time will reveal what time will reveal." The official investigation into Elizabeth Caldwell's disappearance continued sporadically through 1864, utilizing resources from both military intelligence and civilian law enforcement agencies. Union Army investigators interviewed train conductors, hotel proprietors, and ship captains throughout the eastern seaboard, but found no credible evidence of her movements after November 17th. The investigation expanded to include Confederate territories, as some theorists suggested she might have defected to the South, but Southern medical records contained no references to anyone matching her description or capabilities. The final report, compiled by military investigators and classified by order of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, concluded, "The subject known as Elizabeth Caldwell represents a medical anomaly that cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. Her documented presence at the Battle of Gettysburg, verified by multiple credible witnesses, including senior military officers, suggests capabilities that exceed normal human limitations. Extensive investigation has revealed no evidence of fraud, deception, or misidentification. Her medical knowledge appears to be genuine, and her physical condition defies explanation. The case remains unresolved and is recommended for permanent classification to prevent public speculation that might undermine confidence in military medical services. The classified files on Elizabeth Caldwell remained sealed in military archives until 1963, when they were briefly reviewed during the centennial commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg. Historians who examined the documents found them so unusual that most dismissed them as wartime confusion or administrative errors. The few scholars who took the testimonies seriously faced ridicule from academic colleagues who questioned the credibility of witnesses writing under extreme battlefield stress. Yet the testimony remains, documented by witnesses whose credibility was never questioned in any other aspect of their military service, describing a woman who defied aging and whose medical knowledge seemed to span decades of experience despite her apparently youthful appearance. Modern medical understanding provides potential explanations for what Civil War physicians observed but could not understand. Genetic conditions affecting growth hormone production, such as adult growth hormone deficiency, can significantly slow the aging process, creating individuals who appear decades younger than their chronological age. Rare metabolic disorders, including certain forms of hypopituitarism, can arrest physical development while allowing intellectual capacity to continue growing normally. Elizabeth Caldwell may have suffered from a combination of these conditions, creating the appearance of supernatural youth while her actual age accumulated normally. Her extensive medical knowledge could have been acquired through years of intensive self-study and practical experience, enhanced by exceptional memory and observational skills that allowed rapid learning under battlefield conditions. The apparent impossibility of her presence at multiple locations simultaneously during Gettysburg might be explained by the chaos of battle, confused reporting under stress, and the natural tendency of witnesses to embellish extraordinary events. Her uncanny ability to predict patient outcomes could reflect exceptional diagnostic skills developed through years of medical practice rather than supernatural insight. Yet questions remain that even modern science cannot fully answer. How did Elizabeth acquire surgical skills that exceeded those of formerly trained military physicians? What enabled her apparent resistance to fatigue during extended medical procedures? Why did photographic equipment consistently fail to capture her image despite her clear visibility to direct observation? How did she demonstrate knowledge of patients' personal histories that they had never shared? And perhaps most mysteriously, what happened to her after November 1863? The possibility that Elizabeth Caldwell suffered from a rare genetic condition that dramatically slowed her aging process provides a rational framework for understanding the documented testimonies, but it cannot explain all aspects of her documented abilities. Her medical knowledge, her apparent immunity to exhaustion, her uncanny diagnostic abilities, and her mysterious disappearance suggest a complexity that exceeds simple medical explanation. Whether she was an extraordinary individual whose rare condition was misunderstood by 19th-century medicine, or whether some aspects of her story remain genuinely inexplicable, the case of Elizabeth Caldwell represents one of the most thoroughly documented medical mysteries in American history. The American Civil War created conditions for unprecedented medical observation and documentation, yet the case of Elizabeth Caldwell stands apart from all other medical anomalies of the period. The consistency of witness testimonies, the credibility of the observers, and the thorough investigation conducted by military authorities create a foundation of evidence that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Modern medicine can provide possible explanations for many aspects of her condition, but the complete picture remains as puzzling today as it was 160 years ago. This mystery shows us that even in our most documented historical events, some questions resist easy answers. The American Civil War produced thousands of pages of military records, medical reports, and personal testimonies. Yet the case of Elizabeth Caldwell remains as puzzling today as it was 160 years ago. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do some secrets about the woman who never aged remain buried in history? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think really happened to Elizabeth Caldwell. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves unsolved puzzles from America's past. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another mystery that official records tried to forget.